Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest, fan favorite, and a great personal friend of mine, Robert Bryce. I am freshly back from COP in Dubai, still struggling a little bit in the afternoons with the jet lag. So luckily this recording is occurring at 11:24 a.m. my time. I had quite a time at COP, and Robert, you were not there, but you just put out a fabulous article on your Substack called COP28 Gets Coal in Its Stocking. That really caught my attention. I wanted to have you on to try and debrief and get, I guess, a kind of broader sense of where these climate negotiations, the context in which they're occurring energetically.
Sure.
There's some beautiful data visualizations there. We're gonna turn those visuals into some verbal content for our fabulous listeners. So, Robert, warm welcome back.
Thank you. Very always pleased to be with you, Chris.
How have you been? How's the last few days been for you? Last weeks? What are you up to?
It's all good. I've been traveling a lot, been managing some family things, but I have no complaints. I live a charmed life. This energy and power, this is my purpose and my passion. And, I just wake up every day and consider myself incredibly lucky. So, everything is good. The family is good. So
awesome.
All good.
Family first. Listen, so I was, as I said, on the ground in COP. The grounds itself,
70,000 people. What was that like? I mean, what was it? Last year was 35,000. This year, 70. I mean, it's like Woodstock for climate people. How do you describe this?
I've called these climate conferences Climate Versailles in the past. This one, I think, was Climate Burning Man. The actual site, it's the expo site in Dubai. I mean, it is trippy. Uh-huh. There is some incredible architecture. This beautiful dome with sort of Arabic motifs in it that just incredible size and soundscape and visuals and it's up there with some of the best raves I've been to. But in all seriousness, it was hard to get your head around. It's so vast, and the physicality of the space was so vast. It was Las Vegas 10x in terms of the city of Dubai, in terms of how big everything is, how far apart everything is. But the expo grounds were a nightmare just because you try and get from one venue to the other, and it was like a 30-minute walk in some pretty high temperatures for this Canuck over here. What did it look like to you from the outside, a continent away?
Well, first, I've only been to Dubai once, and the architecture there is something else. I mean, it's just as, I described it as though the building goes up this way, and then it turns right, and then it turns left, and then it goes right again. And the architecture is quite amazing. But as far as the COP experience, the COP, the motif or these events, I think after watching them now for more than a decade, it's always kind of the same script that, we're going to go in there and this is going to be the one, and we're going to make these big pledges. And then, it goes on for all these, there's a ton of media coverage because the reporters love to go to these meetings. They have lots of coverage from all the big media outlets, and, this one's going to be different. And, there's this controversy, and then nothing happens, nothing. And right at the end, we don't have an agreement. And then we got to have an agreement. And then right at the 9th hour, there's an agreement. And so in, looking back at this one and the stock take, right? That is what their term of art is for the final document. And it has this tripling renewable capacity, which can't happen. It won't happen because it can happen. And in this agreement, transition away from hydrocarbons. Okay, well, yeah, easy to say. But remember, China, India, and Indonesia did not sign the document. So, okay, well, congratulations. But here you have the three of the fastest growing economies in the world, three of the economies that are adding coal-fired capacity at the fastest rate of any countries in the world. And so I don't know. I mean, I hate to say I'm cynical about it. It's just, I'm kind of, resigned to this repetition of media frenzy. I guess that's what I'd call it, because I think it's mostly about media posturing because, for all of this talk, what happens? Coal consumption continues to rise. IEA just came out with a new coal report saying this year consumption is going to be 8.5 billion tons. In July, they thought it was going to be 8.4 billion. I could go into coal.
We will, Robert. Let me riff a little bit off of some of the things you said. Yeah, I mean, I think as you're mentioning here, it seems like there is just an incredible amount of diplomatic capital spent on just these little sort of turns of phrase, whether it's a phase out, a phase down, whether it's calling on or demanding. This kind of language just seems pretty silly to me, given
Just transition. Don't forget
Just
that.
transition. Yeah, yeah. I mean, just how I've been posting about this recently, but just how wedded we are to fossil fuels and these fantasies about deployments of alternative energy sources. I mean, the only reason that they're economic with big quotation marks is because of the surplus value we get from fossil fuels, which give us this extra wealth that we can pour into subsidies or firming intermittence and things like that. But I'm not going to go on too long of a diatribe there. A couple things that I was sort of questioning. I'm always looking for the realpolitik. I mean, whether that's justifications for war. There's always a grand narrative, and there's something more sort of sometimes cynical or just a realpolitik behind things. So, I mean, like, why do you host a climate conference? Is it like hosting the Olympics? Build some infrastructure, go into debt. This is obviously a place where a lot of wheeling and dealing is happening, and a lot of sort of diplomatic meetings can occur outside of the actual stated goals of the conference. So I think that's kind of the conclusion that I came to. Interesting you mentioning that the BRICS countries essentially, or most of them, didn't sign on. The one thing you didn't mention, and it's sort of giving the nuclear community a lot of joy, is this commitment to a tripling of nuclear. But again, the
Yeah.
geopolitics interesting. Russia, India, China. They are building 46 of the 60 reactors currently under construction around the world. They're the only credible deployers outside of maybe South Korea and the UAE and a handful of others. But the Western nations that signed on, frankly, are fumbling. And, I have great concerns about nuclear. And maybe we'll talk about that a bit later. But just wanted to throw in a few sort of my own 2 cents. Again, sort of combining your outside look and my inside look and thoughts on this conference.
So 70,000, that's just a big I'm just kind of curious, and I don't know whether you know the answer or you speculate on it, but how is it that the number of attendees would double in 1 year? What makes Dubai different from what was Sharm el-Sheikh last year? And is that still partly the hangover from COVID, or is there I don't understand why why the attendee list would, or the number of attendees would increase so dramatically 1 year to the next.
I think it's just a great opportunity to do some wheeling and dealing and, for a variety of different industries to meet up and make deals and hash plans. So that's a big part of it. I mean, Dubai, the infrastructure is pretty incredible. They
Yeah.
are a real bastion of tourism. They could host people. They have an incredible sort of efficiency. Things were organized extremely well. Certainly, the Net Zero Nuclear Summit that I attended, I can't speak highly enough about ENEC and the others that put it on the Emirati side. Incredibly efficient. Sessions basically on time, on budget, kind of thing, just like their nuclear plant. But yeah. I mean, I think that's part of the reason. But certainly, yeah, a lot of deals are going on. There's a lot of stuff under that veneer of the climate politics.
Right. And so the net zero nuclear part of that, what was that like? Because I thought that was interesting, and I think of all the things that happened, this tripling nuclear pledge. Now we can say this is a stretch goal, but by 2050, maybe it could happen. There are a lot of challenges. I've written about this. What's regulation, capital, and fuel? Right. It's always the same things. Right. But just yesterday, we had Cairo, the NRC, or well, I guess it was earlier this week. Kairos Power announced they got an approval from the NRC for a construction permit for a gas cooled reactor. Now, that is a big deal, right? Because I don't think it cost them $500 million in 6 years like it did with NuScale. And this is a new type of reactor. So that I thought was really good news. And so, we've seen many steps back, but I also see a few steps forward here that give me some hope that, yeah, maybe this time it is in fact different.
Yeah, I mean, listen, that announcement to triple nuclear energy was a hard fought battle, by the hosts and the organizers and the World Nuclear Association, and again, ENEC. Hats off to those folks. They did some amazing work in terms of the diplomacy to make that happen. It is, an enormous kind of wind in the sails. I think what I'm saying is the easy part is kind of done. We have, the social license, the policy, the political license to get going on nuclear. There are certain countries, I would say that they have in common a dirigisme, which is basically that there's some degree of state involvement in planning and industrial planning of a highly strategic sector. Those would be your Russia's, China's, South Korea's, Japan in its heyday, UAE right now that can deploy nuclear quickly, effectively, efficiently. But the countries that signed on largely, there is one reactor under construction in the U.S. There are four in Europe. There's three in South America. this is a little bit piddling. The U.S. obviously has a lot of diplomatic prominence, and they are behind the major deployed reactors around the world in terms of the BWR and PWR technology. And I think there's a lot of what the U.S. is falling back on because of its utter failure at deployment is, well, we have the best reactor technology in the world. And I think there's a little bit of you got to learn to crawl before you can do backflips and gymnastic tumbling routines. And one of the big themes I moderated a panel on fueling the race or fueling this effort to triple nuclear energy. And in doing the research for it, discovered that the significant uprate of Centris's HALEU cascade will produce only 900 kilos a year. That is enough to fuel a single eVinci microreactor, a 5 megawatt electric microreactor. So it just gives you a sense. 9 of the 10 reactors in the in the DOE's advanced reactor demonstration program are HALEU dependent. So major challenges. I said, I didn't want to use the F word in polite company, but failure is absolutely, it shouldn't be an option given the stakes, but it's absolutely an option. And this is not a moment for hubris or arrogance. This is a moment, particularly in the West, to be paying careful attention, to, again, the host country, how they did it. And I worry about the political and industry architecture and whether the West is capable of sort of pulling that together to in any way imitate the successful deployments we've seen in the past. Even in the US, we'll say, okay, well, maybe it wasn't sort of state driven, but these large utilities are kind of like states in and of themselves. That rate base is kind of analogous to a tax base, that ability to offer cheap financing based upon, de-risking with the rate base. I don't see a way around that in terms of the free market.
I don't either, Chris. You mentioned the countries where we're seeing strong nuclear development, and there are countries where you have strong state involvement. And, China, obviously, South Korea, South Korea, yes, obviously, India, obviously. And I mentioned the fact that Kairos Power got this construction permit from the NRC, which is great news, to start construction on a gas-cooled reactor. Well, that happened the same week that in Shandong province, Huawei Group in China announced that they have actually begun commercial operation of a gas-cooled reactor. So, and that took them, that project started in 2012. That was an 11-year project. They had problems getting that thing going, right? But it wasn't 14 years like Vogtle. It wasn't 18 years like Okaludo 3. So, this is going to take sustained bipartisan long-term commitment from states, from the federal governments to make this happen. And, I see the stirrings of this in Washington, and I think there's a possibility of that happening. And, it's slowly gaining momentum. But let's be clear, we are miles behind China and Russia and India when it comes to this. And you mentioned those three, and I'm just looking at the IAEA's list of under construction. And what does it say here? It says Russia has, 3 reactors under construction, China 22, and India 8. So that's 30.
But don't forget those Russian builds in Bangladesh and Egypt and Turkey. They have a number going overseas, so that gets your Russian numbers up.
I see how you're getting there. Okay, yeah. So that makes sense. Okay, right. These are they're measuring each country. So yeah, okay. So you're counting Rosatom activity in all these other countries as well, right? But this is a state champion, right? This is a state-owned entity that's doing this, right? And they're getting state financing to do this, and these are long-term, decadal relationships that they're building. So. And it's based around fuel.
It's not that the resources aren't there. I mean, Jigar Shah and the LPO are sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars, $200+ billion. And, but it's private sector led, public enabled, which is a very bizarre form of, free market capitalism, if you ask me. And so, yeah, it just seems to me like there's.
Well, and let's be clear, so much of that is going to be reserved for the favored, technologies of solar, wind, hydrogen, right? Solar, wind, hydrogen batteries. I mean, look, I get this. I'm following Jigar Shah. I've debated Jigar Shah. This is like, come on. What are they going to put their money in, really? And also, I think the utilities are going to be pretty gun shy on new nuclear, given what we've seen in terms of the record of deployment. Look at NuScale. They had to fold their tent on the project at Idaho National Lab. It was a big blow to domestic nuclear. X-Energy is not going to go public now. Their deal with Ares Capital Management that fell apart. So. you know, I'm adamantly optimistic, but this connection of private capital and public support is a difficult one, and it's more difficult in the U.S. because of these ideas around free markets and electricity. Well, it's not a freaking market. It's not. It's not a commodity. It's a service, and it requires a change in mindset.
Here's like a broad theme of something I've been thinking about, and I'd be interested to
Sure.
hear your thoughts. But free markets, I think, are very good at innovation. That's pretty undeniable.
Yeah.
Centrally planned economies in the most extreme forms, things like China and Russia under communism, really good at banging out the same product forever in enormous quantities. There's not market signals to say, "Hey, slow down on that," or "Hey, could you improve that a little bit?" So the famous example is a German motorcycle that the Soviets liked. It was about a 1943 or 1944 vintage. They set up a production line for that, and they built that same goddamn motorbike with the same components for the next 50 years or so until the Soviet Union collapsed, right? And yeah, sure, they could bang out a big numbers, but there wasn't innovation. Now, people will say this, and maybe it's controversial, but innovation is a tricky thing in nuclear. It maybe even hurts nuclear to do a little too much innovation too fast. It's the hardest of hardwares. There's a real inertia and a slowness to this. So maybe part of the reason why Russia and China and maybe South Korea as well are dancing around us is because central planning favors that sort of economic activity, that sort of just banging something out over and over and over again, which seems to be the recipe for fast deployments of nuclear. So I'm not sure if you've got
That's
any
what we
thoughts
saw in
on
France.
that.
That's what we saw in France, right? They picked one design and then they built a ton of them, right? And so you have their engineers can go from one plant to the other. It's that doesn't. It was interesting. It was many years ago now, maybe 10 or 12, but it was only in Paris where I learned from a guy who was a French academic and a guy who studied the nuclear sector at 3 Mile Island in the U.S. There were two different control systems for the two different reactors at 3 Mile Island. It was like he was looking at it and he's like, "You Americans are crazy. What are you doing?" Right? So this, I agree that the challenge is going to be regulatory state/state support, right? But also settling on a design that we're going to say this is the one. It might not be the best one, and it might not be the most thermally efficient or whatever, but this is the one we're going to pick. And I think that it's interesting to see how you're seeing this in Ontario, right? You've got Bruce Power. You're going to go ahead with the CANDO. And you're also, what is the other design you're picking, which is the BWRX 300, which apparently is what Duke is going to build as well in the Carolinas. And what are they going to use? It's not HALEU, it's LEU, right? So they're going to use the conventional fuel supply chain that has been in place for decades. So that's one part of the risk envelope, one part of the risk assessments or risk issues, right, that they're having to deal with in supply chain. Well, we'll take that one off the table because we know that the LEU supply chain is mature and we can count on that. So, but I agree. I mean, I think these challenges are going to have to be very clearly addressed, and they're going to have to be addressed on a kind of an international basis if we're going to see this anything like the tripling that is the goal that was mentioned, which is heartening. There's now 25 countries now have signed on. It was 22 originally. They've added 3 since then. So I think that's very positive news. But again, we have to be very sober and very clear-eyed about this.
I totally agree. And just getting back to that contrast between central planning, free market, and the benefit of
Yeah.
banging out the same thing over and over again versus innovation. I guess China has got that benefit of, I don't know how to put it diplomatically, borrowing, stealing IP from the West. And so, I don't know the exact story of the acquisition of the high temperature gas reactor IP that they're using to bring online. First commercially operating, reactor of that category. I got to double check that because I know the Germans were running it, the South Africans were running it. I'm not sure if that was commercial. I'm sure I'll get some feedback and learn some more about that. But in any case, parking that theme, another thing, as you mentioned, the X300 and picking a design and moving serially with it, it really does seem like that reactor is got that first mover
Yeah.
advantage, a credible deployer at OPG, and there's a lot of interest. Ernie Moniz and several of the NGOs he's involved with, EFI, Nuclear Threat Initiative, and Clean Air Task Force, they put out this nuclear playbook that came out while we we're at COP, and it was. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Robert, because it was interesting. It's coming out of an American ecosystem on nuclear, and it's saying to embarking countries, countries interested in taking up nuclear, be technologically conservative. use low enriched uranium, use something like a pressurized water reactor once through fuel cycle, make sure it's proven, it's got operational experience. I mean, this is all just incredibly common sense. And what I
Right.
pointed out in my conversation with Ernie was, well, they're established and embarking nations, but in that established category, there are nations that are re-embarking, right? They're not quite in the same position as a country that's like Poland that's new to nuclear, but they're not much further ahead in terms of the atrophy that's gone on there. And
Right.
maybe you should follow your own advice.
Which France comes to mind, right? The EPR, right? They look at all the trouble they had at Ocoludo. Now maybe that's different. And maybe they learned there, and that's going to be the way they go forward. I really so in this next as we look forward at what is going to be deployed. I really one of the most interesting geopolitical technology deployment questions is, well, which country in Europe is going to be the one that can deploy the fastest, right? And who has the most motivation? And I ask this question a lot because I think it's just really interesting on a whole lot of levels. So is it Poland? Right? Poland has a lot of reason to accelerate deployment of nuclear. So does Romania. But France, Bill Magwood said, "Well, I'd put my money on France. They have the infrastructure, the personnel, they have the engineering history. So which will it be? I don't know, but it's the fact that at least now they're mouthing the right words. I take that as very positive. So what but when you come back from COP now, I mean, you were there, I wasn't. So did it make you more hopeful? Did it make you less, or just kind of more sober? You talked to all these people. You were hobnobbing with the big wigs, and in the case of Ernie Moniz, some bad haircuts. But I'm digress. What would you? How do? What did you had time to kind of decompress? How do you see it?
Well, I mean, I had three distinct experiences. One was at the expo grounds themselves, which again, it was a bit dystopian for me as a pale white guy who sweats in any temperature above about 15 degrees C. So that kind of clouded that experience. Um, but I did meet some.
You wouldn't last in Texas, my friend. You
Oh
would
my
not
god!
last in
Oh my
Austin.
god!
No.
But I again still pretty cynical of that side of things. Interesting. Some you'll walk into premiers or prime ministers, or there's this kid from Australia, William Shackle. Just a phenomenon of advocacy down there, who managed to snag a impromptu interview with Emmanuel Macron, kind of walking with his microphone alongside, and Emmanuel offered up unscripted, or unprovoked's the wrong word, but he offered up this statement that Australia should overturn its ban. It got front page news. So you have those kind of opportunities in the green and blue zones of the official COP ground. So that was experience number one. Experience number two was the Net Zero Nuclear Summit put on by ENEC and the World Nuclear Association. That was absolutely fascinating, getting to sort of watch, again, from an outsider perspective as an anthropologist. It was mostly folks from the US that were speaking on stage. The Emiratis were in the audience, listening. And I'm actually trying to think if there was a session. No, there were a couple sessions where they were on stage and offering some of their expertise. But I kind of felt like it should have been the opposite, with the folks from the West who are struggling, whose nuclear sectors are really in major danger. They should have been sitting in the audience and humbly asking for lessons from the Emiratis. And that is, I think, occurring behind the scenes. The reactors at Baraka are now basically finished. There's just some hot functional testing, I believe, for the fourth one. It'll come on next year. They're looking at new nuclear. They're looking at both SMRs and large nuclear. They during cold winters, when they don't have an aircon load, those Baraka nuclear plants is providing sometimes up to about 80% of their entire electricity needs. Obviously, they peak in the summer and they got a lot of aircon to do, but there's also 12 gigawatts of oil and gas infrastructure that's not grid connected. So that's an opportunity for more big nuclear for them. But I think, again, a big sort of, it's not a commodity, it's human resources, but a huge sort of play they have is to consult with Western countries and provide lessons. If those lessons are applicable, again, to the sort of political and economic structures in the West is yet to be seen, but certainly saw a lot of MOUs signed between ENEC and a number of Western companies there.
Right.
That's number two.
Terrestrial signs.
Terrestrial,
Right.
yeah. Moltex, a whole number of them. And then, sorry, so that was the second thing. And then the third one was the experience of going with the decouple crew, getting red zone access to the Baraka nuclear plant and filming there, and really getting to spend, a good 12 hours with a number of people from the plant, a senior reactor operator, Marwa. Shame to say I can't remember her last name right now, but we had just a wonderful tour, and we'll be releasing a great video on that experience. So overall, I went in deeply cynical and sort of what am I doing here? And I came out super energized. I don't think we're going to solve climate change with nuclear. I think likely. Well, let me just be honest. This tripling is not going to happen, but good to set some aspirations and goals. And but I do feel like I have an important role to play, particularly here in Canada, with doing our damnedest. So I came out kind of energized with the intention to do that. So my ambitions are a little less grandiose, probably a little more realistic, but like I said, overall it was a good experience. Glad I went.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And you don't know until you get there. And my colleague Tyson Culver went and he screened some of the episodes of our upcoming docuseries, and he thought it was a great experience. And now he went to the COP last year at Sharm el Sheikh as well, and participated in some nuclear things there. But again, I'm very much with you in terms of the need for a very sober, clear-eyed approach, because global energy demand continues to rise and rise very quickly. Electricity demand is doubling every 2 decades, and so it's an enormous challenge just to meet the growing demand for power, regardless of the source. And it's even more difficult when you say, well, we want it to be low carbon and zero emissions or whatever. I mean, that makes the challenge even more difficult to kind of even conceptualize, much less achieve.
Yeah, which I think is a great sort of tie-in and lead into what we actually came here to really talk about, Robert. Great to have a chit chat and a chance to sort of vent a little bit and digest the COP experience. But I really wanted to chat with you about this piece you put out. COP28 gets coal in its stocking. I thought, if I had written it, I might have called it sort of tried to work in an inconvenient truth into the title, but I thought it was a great title, very seasonal. And put things in perspective. You have these great data visualizations, and there's always a challenge to turn that into getting a sense of the relative scale of what is happening in the world, additions of nuclear versus additions of coal. John Kerry was there saying no new permitting should be allowed for new coal plants. The
Right.
U.S. is still burning quite a bit of coal. Maybe you can tell us how much. Seemed like a bit of green colonialism to me, but that's my lead in. You take it away on the coal front here.
Sure. Well, I've been following the coal market now for, now what, 14 years, right? And I've been in underground coal mines. I've been in above ground coal mines. And I look at coal through this lens of, well, this is a fuel that we just can't do without. And when I say we, I mean the global we, right? That regardless of all the downsides that are obvious, right? High CO2 emissions, high CO2 emissions, air pollutants, sulfur dioxide, ash ponds, all these other things we very clearly know about. But still, today, globally, we're 35% of all the power produced in the world is still produced from coal. Now, 141 years after Edison used it on Pearl Street. So, what is it about this, and where is that market going? And there are a bunch of NGOs that I follow that track their work, and they try and downplay the growth in coal. Well, okay, you can downplay it, but I dug into the data that it was published by Global Energy Monitor, which I follow closely, and I think their work is really pretty good. But their whole spin, and it is spin that they put on their numbers, is, oh well, the amount of new coal outside of China is declining. Okay, well,
Let's
okay,
talk about
outside of
China for a
China.
second then.
Yeah, well, that's just a little bit of a kind of a head fake. Why? Because in their own data, the amount of operating capacity for coal in China is 1 million megawatts. In the United States, it's 200,000. We have 200,000 megawatts of installed capacity. China today has 5x the installed coal fired capacity as the US. India has slightly more. But the thing that was really interesting to me and important to tease out from the Global Energy Monitor's own spreadsheets was this issue of how much is being proposed and how much is actually under construction. So, and I realize it's funny, I don't have an editor. I'm on Substack, so I have to make sure what I'm writing. I'm thinking about and make sure
Right.
I'm right. And so I run it through Grammarly 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 times. And I publish usually on my piece at 4 in the morning, 4:05. Like Doomberg, he publishes at 4. I publish usually at 4:05. I woke up at 2:30 realizing, oh crap, I misapprehended one part of the spread. I got up at 2:30 in the morning because I wanted to go back and make sure I had to correct it. Okay, well, so what's the punchline? Today in China, there are 204,000 megawatts of new capacity under construction, and 2/3 of that is in China. So
So
130
that
some odd
just
thousand
again,
megawatts.
for those who struggle a little bit with numbers and energy literacy, that's 200 gigawatt scale coal plants
That's right. Yeah.
under
200
construction.
gigawatts. So
Yeah.
it's an entire addition of the US entire coal fleet is now under construction globally. And of that number, roughly 130,000 megawatts is what is under construction in China. So yes, China is building a lot of coal, but so is Indonesia. So is India. And those are the three countries, China, India, and Indonesia. And I think there was a fourth that did not sign the final agreement at the COP28
I see
meeting.
that. Yeah.
So, again, I'm not sitting here cheering for coal. What I am doing is being a reporter and looking at the numbers and saying, okay, we can talk about all this and we bully for the announcements. And I understand what the ideas are, but this requires real sobriety. And so that was one of the graphics that I published in my Substack. I looked at the top 12 coal countries with their operating capacity, coal-fired capacity, and their planned expansions in megawatts. And China, yes, they have over a million. I think it's actually about 1.1 million megawatts of installed capacity. They have another 300,000 or so that is in the queue, that is either announced, pre-permitted, or permitted. So remember, last year they permitted 2 new coal plants per week last year. So this idea that we're going beyond coal, which is of course the slogan that the Sierra Club is using, and Michael Bloomberg is spending $500 million on the Beyond Carbon campaign to shut down every coal plant in America. Okay, you can do that, but it doesn't mean you stopped coal.
Yeah. Just to, again, put these numbers in perspective, a figure I've heard, this is from my friend Nate Hagen's. We have a metabolism at any given time. We're consuming about 19 terawatts of energy. I know that's going to be a bit tricky to make comparisons to capacity, but you're basically saying China has a terawatt of coal, India has a terawatt of coal installed. The U.S., has 200 gigawatts. So just I think that gives you a sense of just how enormous these fleets are, and just in terms of primary energy, in terms of the fossil component, rough numbers here. Oil's a bit more than a third, nat gas a little less than a third, coal a bit more than a third. But those are I call them sort of the holy trinity or unholy trinity of fossil fuels. I always say the liquid hydrocarbons are the whatever the superior one or the most important one, the most mission critical one. But I think that does give you a sense of just how massive the global coal fleet is. And you are saying there's some retirements happening in the West, although Germany is doing some reactivations, we see, and there's a big return to coal in Europe. Maybe you want to chat about, but overall, more coal than ever.
Overall, more coal than ever, despite all of this discussion about what is going on. And um, uh, to your point, there's about 500. The latest numbers from the Statistical Review globally in terms of hydrocarbon use. If you can think about that, it's 500 exajoules per year of use, and oil's about 190 exajoules, coal's about 160, and gas is about 140. So coal and gas together are about 300, oil's about 200, roughly in rough terms. So, these are very large numbers. And one of the things that I've been working on since the COP meeting ended is making another few graphics, because one of the things that I view as my job, and one of the things that if I've had some success in my career, a lot of it is due to the fact that I'm giving people comparisons, right? To put one number next to another that allows them to put things in perspective, right? One of the best pieces of advice I ever got in my career was from Edward Tufte. So when you give people a number, give them something to compare it to, right? A metric that they know that they can then react to, right? That they, okay, so 12 exajoules is current global solar consumption globally, 12 exajoules. Well, so by itself, oil alone is 16 times as large as global solar, 16x. And remember, we can't use solar to drive our diesel trucks or to run our ships or our airplanes. So these ideas are, well, we'll triple renewable energy capacity. Okay, well, fine. That's great. It doesn't mean you're going to displace any coal. Maybe you'll displace some coal, maybe, but you won't displace any oil, right? But we have to be very clear-eyed and very sober about what is the rhetoric versus the reality? And that's where I see, my job and what I try to do is let's talk about reality, because energy realism, this is my line, I'm going to use it over and over. Energy realism is energy humanism, and we need more of both.
Yeah, yeah. Again, these sort of big picture analyses and why COP is destined to fail and why we are married to fossil fuels. I don't say that with any joy. I mean, I think there's some twin challenges here. Climate change is going to increase and become the bigger challenge potentially, and then we have an energy challenge, and that will be the depletion, I think, particularly of the liquid hydrocarbons. But that aside, I mean, a term and a figure that I've found useful just for this kind of 30,000 foot view on energy, and again, why we're not making progress. Barrel of oil contains 1,700 kilowatt hours of energy. A human can perform zero point 0.6 kilowatt hours over the course of a day. Rough
Yeah,
calculations, efficiencies taken into context. Again, I'm quoting Huygens and some others here, but we're talking about 400 billion human slaves worth of energy that are propping up
right.
a population of 8 billion. Probably 2-3 billion of those aren't working because their kids are aged, right? That is just an enormous amount of energy that's behind the human enterprises, behind the modern industrial enterprise. And the idea that you can just fire 400 billion laborers worth of energy and replace that with solar panels and wind turbines or nuclear that all require some of that labor, some of that fossil energy for things that are just too difficult to decarbonize, or are not viable to decarbonize without the surpluses of energy. I mean, that's it's a bit depressing, frankly, to sort of look at the world that way. But I would rather not be delusional. And again, maybe I have to reset my expectations. It doesn't mean I'm not advocating for nuclear anymore. I certainly am. But it just ties you into again how the discovery of fire enabled Homo sapiens with our small jaws and short guts and big brains. The discovery of the use of hydrocarbons is what has led to Homo industrialis, maybe I'll call it. And the
Yeah.
origin of that species is as tied to fossil fuels as ever. And I don't see a disentanglement there, despite some of the nuclear folks dreams about I mean, it's very Lewis Straussian, energy too cheap to meter, but that we'll have endless cheap energy, and that will make up for any kind of diminishment in terms of fossil fuels, et cetera. I bit of a rant there, Robert, but just kind of had to get that off my chest.
No, I'm remembering is well, Homo sapiens. It's a wise man or knowledgeable man, right? If the Latin, but a friend of mine, I forgot who it was. He said, actually, we're man the fire maker, right?
Yeah,
That the fire making was the thing that has really separated us from every other living creature, right? And so you have the what was it, the Icarus parable, right, about fire, and that we or no, it was who's the one who's tortured
Prometheus,
for
Prometheus, yeah,
giving Prometheus,
yeah,
right? Thank
chained to
you.
a rock, his liver
It
pecked out every day by an
right,
eagle, I believe.
yeah,
Yeah,
right. Icarus flew too close to the sun, but the other part of this that to me is so important, and it's one of the things that I focus on, and some of the work that I'm most proud of, and also the one part of the work that I do that I think is the most meaningful is the renewable rejection database, right? So you have this bias, and I, what, and the thing that a theme that I've been meaning to write about, but I'll summarize it. It's very easy to say. I've been trying to think about how I write it, but the tradition of environmentalism, the tradition of environmental protection, of conservationism, of preserving landscapes and wildlife and whales and birds, it's been completely supplanted, completely replaced by climatism and renewable energy fetishism. And Steve Brick talks about this from Clean Air Task Force, that somehow renewables are the end in themselves, and you see that in this stock take from Dubai, tripling renewable energy capacity by 2030. Well, that's an impossible
2030.
goal. It will
Yeah.
not happen. It's just like it is so fanciful. That's 6 years from now. And the point is that I'm getting to here is, well, they say this because the idea of renewable energy is so it's catnip, right? It's just politically palatable. Everybody just loves this idea of because of that branding, renewable. Oh, well, then it's clean, it's green. No, it's not. It's the opposite. And it requires so much destruction of the environment that it's become this kind of credo, this own religion in itself. And that was the part that, to me, of the things that came out of the COP28, this is their headline number. This is their headline achievement. We're going to triple renewable capacity in 6 years. Well, the hell you are. There's no way it can be done. Even if you have the land, you don't have the amount of transformers, you don't have the copper, you don't have the linemen, you don't have the electricians, the people who can actually do it. But I think this is part of this broader um, betrayal of the environment and the concept of protection of environmental of sacred spaces in nature, and it's been all just sacrificed at the altar of climatism and renewable energy fetishism.
Yeah, I mean, apropos, digging up landscapes, turning them inside out. I'm reading a great book right now, Ed Conway, Material World, fabulous journalist,
Oh,
fabulous
right,
book.
yeah, I want to get that book. I want to
Yeah.
have him on the
Let me tell you,
podcast.
he's hard to get on the podcast. I've been chasing his publicist around for over a month, pestering her every other day with emails. But I promise.
He's with Sky News, right?
He
Isn't that
is.
where he's? Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Anyway, one of the things he talks about is copper, and sort of paleolithically or prehistorically, or I guess in the copper age before the bronze age, you could literally just find bits of pure copper lying around and, hit them with a rock and turn them into something. And then, we got into pretty damn good ore grades of around, I think, 20% up in Cornwall, England. And then by the, 1900s, early 1900s, we're down to 6%. By the year 2000, I think we're down to about 2 or 1%. Now we're sort of 0.6%. The amount of overburden we need to remove, the amount of energy required to blast, and the massive 400-ton trucks, the milling, grinding these particles even finer to try and extract that metal. I mean, what I love about this book is it's just rubbing your face in the supply chain, and what you're seeing, and there's this agenda, there's this idea of sort of superabundance on one side and sort of Malthusian limits on the other. And on the superabundance front, it's this narrative of, humans are endlessly ingenious. We solve problems. We're not like bacteria in a petri dish. We've got technology. And that is all very true. But it's ignoring this underlying reality of energy powering all of that. There's this strange coincidence of the last 250 years that we went from, horse-drawn wagons to space travel to the moon. And underpinning that may have been a little bit of energy. But anyway, it just goes to
Yeah.
show, more and more energy and high quality, low entropy forms of energy are being required to crush this low ore grade
Right.
rock to pull out more copper. Yes, it's never been cheaper, essentially, in terms of the equivalent of sort of worked hours to get that copper, but it all is dependent on energy. So if you want to retire those 500 billion, slave labor worth of fossil energy, you ain't getting the copper out of the rocks to build, an energy infrastructure, stochastic, high entropy, shitty, intermittent electricity only, essentially. It's a whole house of cards. And when you can sort of step back and look at the world through the eyes of folks like Ed Conway or Higgins or Smill or others, I'm just feeling a lot of kind of sobriety, looking at the whole picture, and finally sort of coming to a more fulsome understanding of why no progress gets made at these COPs. We're married, we're married, and we can't divorce them.
Well,
Fossil fuels
and
can't live with
yeah.
them, can't live without them. I don't know.
I, I'm married to the same woman proudly for 37 years, but there's some divorce joke in here, right? About, well, my first wife, right, or something. Rodney Dangerfield should step in here, right? But this idea, well, we're just going to quit using hydrocarbons, and these just stop oil spoiled brat idiots. I look at them. I just want them. I want to lock them under the jail. Better yet, I want to send them to rural Zambia, and you are not allowed to use any hydrocarbons of any form for 5 years, and then you report back and tell us how you like it.
Wow.
Because I just think it is this nature of these spoiled kids who don't know how good they have it, and they just want to perform this kind of public kind of anxiety play. And but back to the point about metals and the issues of the energy transition, I think this is one of the most interesting things that I think about now in terms, because I don't quite know what to think about it. I've had Simon Michaud on the Power Hungry podcast from the Finnish Geological Survey, and he is on the same track on terms of declining ore qualities and what is going to be required as we use these lower quality ores. Well, we have to process them more. Well, that means you need more bulldozers, you need more front end loaders, you need more cranes, more shovels, all the stuff that's going to burn hydrocarbons in order to make the crap that you're supposedly going to use to quit using hydrocarbons. Well, okay, well, how much tail chasing are we going to do here? And the part that is confusing is so I'm just looking at the copper price chart, right? Because everyone's saying, well, copper prices are going to go up. Well, they've actually been flat, really. It's 390 a pound now. It's below what it was in early 2022 of nearly $5. But on a long-term basis, it's really about the same as it's been for the last 3 years. Now, will it go up? Well, maybe. Who knows anything anymore? This is the part where everything in the world seems confusing to me today.
I mean, I guarantee you, price of energy goes up significantly, or we stop using you stop using fossil fuels, and the price of copper will skyrocket. It used to take 40 years to produce a ton of copper, pre-fossil, and then I think we got into a year or something. Now we're down to it takes the equivalent of 4 days of labor, maybe even less, to get a ton of copper. But you know, uh, there was that bet between Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simons, one of the most famous bets in the
Oh yeah,
world, right? About number of
yeah.
commodities and whether they'd get more expensive or less. And if they'd picked a different time frame, some of them would have been more expensive in dollar value, but not in terms of the amount of hours of human labor required
Right.
to pay for that cost, which is, I think, a lot of
or
people
or,
argue
or in
more.
ounces of gold equivalent, right?
But
And so,
here's a really
go ahead.
interesting historical
Yeah.
analogy, right? So as the ore grades go down, some of these Chilean copper mines start becoming unviable, and I think it was the Carnegies, the Panama Canal. They'd finished digging the Panama Canal, and they moved those massive steam shovels down to the Atacama or wherever those copper mines are. And so they started applying, incredible amounts of fossil energy in these massive machines, and that's what unleashed an incredible amount of wealth from even lower ore grades. So there you have that perfect example of what has enabled Ehrlich's bet to be broken by Julian Simons is the application of ever increasing amounts of fossil energy. So I don't know. This book
Well,
by
and
Ed Conway,
it's
it's a must read. We're going to have him on soon, but
yeah, no, I'd look forward to hearing that because I've known about that book. It was only recently published in the U.S. It
yeah,
was published in Europe 6 or 8 months ago. But just one quick, here's the other counterfactual, right, to what you're just saying, because I don't disagree, but it's one of the things in my own head as I try and work through these things. Well, okay, who's right if you think about, well, the quality of our oil and gas reservoirs is declining, therefore the price should go up. Well, yes, except the price of oil today is roughly the same as it was when I was in grade school on a constant dollar basis. The price of electricity has gone down on a constant dollar basis. I was talking to a friend of mine, Chris Wright, who's the CEO of Liberty Energy. They're one of the biggest hydraulic fracturing companies in the world. They frack about one of every 5 wells in the United States. And he pointed out that in the Haynesville Shale in Louisiana, that what was tier 2 acreage, right? The acreage, it wasn't quite so good as what they had before. They thought, well, we're going to get lower production. Well, instead they changed their recipe on how much sand they put per foot of the horizontal lateral, and what was thought to be tier 2 acreage is producing as much as what used to be tier 1 acreage. So I'm not saying this goes on forever, but it's the constant battle and the constant interplay between manpower, money, and technology, right? And we're getting better at using less and less manpower, labor, and less at capital, and better because we're utilizing more technology. And this is the story of the shale revolution, which has fundamentally changed the U.S. The fortunes of the U.S. energy economy. And thankfully, I mean, the amount of money that has been saved by U.S. consumers because of this confluence of private property rights, capital, technology, and drilling prowess. I mean, it's just and private ownership of mineral rights, maybe the most important. But all of those things together have just had an incredible effect on the U.S. economy, and we're really the envy of the rest of the world, and for the reason we continue to have low cost energy.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, but you are committing that sin of classical and neoclassical economics of talking capital, labor, and technology, but leaving energy out of the equation. Right? It's been cheap, abundant. You don't even need to factor it in. It's substitutable. It's just any other input. And of course, as the copper example illustrates, or even I guess as fracking illustrates, there's a bunch of energy you got to put in. I mean, that's why
No,
microreactors are
no,
kind of
no,
the
no
talk of
doubt
the
about it,
town in
and
terms of
that's
powering frac rigs and stuff. Yeah,
right. And so, and I take, this is Nate Hagen's kind of overview, right? With that, energy is not just any other commodity, and I totally agree with that. But my point is not to deny that, but rather that our application of technology and energy in the technology allows us to use more energy. So the more energy, it's the weird part in the very odd fact about the energy business is the more we find, the more we find. The more oil and gas we find, the more oil and gas we find. It's truly incredible. And I'm not standing here to be a cheerleader for the industry. I'm just observable
Yeah, yeah.
facts show that over time, despite the reality that we have recovered massive amounts of reserves, the amount of oil reserves in the globally continue to rise. So it's just it's such an amazing industry. The energy and power both. I mean, that's why I consider myself so fortunate. I get to study this stuff, talk about it, and just puzzle through it all the time because I just find it endlessly fascinating.
Well, and I think we're both fascinated and frustrated, probably in equal parts, with the potential
Pissed
and
off.
yeah, of nuclear to do something similar. I mean, there's so many incredibly talented and smart people in the sector, but I have to say, even in Ontario, where we have so many of the right preconditions, we've got, thankfully we've turned the federal government around. They were adamantly anti-nuclear. They're the most bullishly pro-nuclear government I can sort of list right now, and certainly in terms of their policy list. Provincial government on board, municipalities on board, social license, incredibly capable institutions like Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power, a hot supply chain, and even there, looking at the ISO predictions for nuclear deployment. I mean, we're looks like we're going to be refurbishing about 2/3 of the Pickering plant. We're losing a third of it. We're going to replace that third just with those 4 SMRs at Darlington. So we haven't made any progress. And then we're going to add, new big nuclear at Bruce, God willing, doesn't come online until the mid to late 2040s. So this idea that we've got
So the
limitless
feedback, what
clean,
you're saying is that
yeah.
despite what Canada is doing and really leading the world, you're treading water, really.
Not true. I mean, there will be additions. We'll net out at 4,800 megawatts after losing that bit of Pickering and replacing it with the 4 SMRs. We'll net out at positive 4,800 megawatts. But again, that doesn't happen until the 2040s, and that's with a lot of the preconditions there. If let's say we had the U.S. was Russia at our border and we had more of an imperative, I think we could go a bit faster. But this idea that we can just bring limitless clean nuclear energy online with a snap of a finger, I'm sorry, I see that a lot in this community, and it won't make me popular, but we got to have a reality check. And if we approach this with anything but absolute humility, particularly in the West, about how to do this, and without a strong desire to learn and study what worked in the past, what's working currently, that's where I see things falling flat on their face, particularly in the U.S. The
And
discourse
to me,
there is.
that comes back to the fuel thing. I mean, I just I interviewed Bill Magwood, right, from the he's at now I'm forgetting his title, but he's in Paris, right, and he's international. He's an American guy, right, but he's I asked him, well, which is the most important thing? What do we have to tackle first? Is it the regulation? Is it the capital? Is it the fuel? He said, no, you have to do them all. But okay, so I'll take that point, but to me, as I think about it, I think the fuel part is the one that seems the stickiest to me. And that Magwood is the director general of the Nuclear Energy Agency. That's part of the OECD. I just looked it up, but to me, and you pointed this out, that Centrus, yeah, they've started producing HALEU at their new facility in Ohio, but it's 900 kilograms, and you said it's enough for one 5 megawatt reactor. Well, we don't need megawatts; we need
Well, and
terawatts.
the industry is promising, and really over promising, that SMRs and microreactors are going to be this panacea. The sea change are going to be cheap. They're going to roll off assembly lines. They haven't even talked about having the fuel for them, but like we are going to be facing some real reality and frankly disappointment compared to where expectations have been set. And I think that's a huge error. Fuel, absolutely. It's interesting. I think every country in the world has different difficulties with nuclear, some far less and some far more. The USA and the EU, about just under a quarter of their enrichment services are Russian, and there's legislation in the US right now to ban not just uranium but the enriched fuel as well. Russia has just said today that they may preempt that and decide at their choosing when there's no longer any enrichment services going to the US. But it's interesting. I ran into a few Japanese nuclear folks at COP, and they said their number one constraint is human resources. And if you think about that, the demography of Japan, where the replacement rate, for kids is like 1.1 or 1.2 for a couple. You think about that nuclear industry being shut down for 10, 15 years. And you think about young people. Okay, is this a sector I want to go in? Do I want to study nuclear engineering if this industry has been shut down and dead? So that is their absolute crunch. So it's patterned differently all over the world. In the U.S., I'd say the challenge is really, well, they got all the challenges, honestly: HR, fuel, competent institutions, and again, this kind of ecosystem between government, industry, et cetera. It's just so complex, and there's so many divergent interests. It was interesting on that fuel cycle panel when talking about this fuel pinch in terms of Russia. You have the Urenco guy, Boris Schutz, saying, "No problem, we'll just overfeed the machines." Um, you've got the Centrist guy, and Centrist is most of their uranium is, they're brokering Russian fuel sales, saying, no, we got to move past Russia. And I think Centrist wants to add some more enrichment capacity. Urenco is happy to sell into a tight market. It's kind of like, I guess, a bit of an OPEC situation. So you have all these divergent interests, and God bless them. It's to fiduciary interest to their shareholders. But that's not in the national interest. That's not in the interest of deploying nuclear. That's not in the strategic interest of, treading water, let alone keeping up with Russia and China. So there's so much going on there. And again, I think the biggest issue in the West is, and I lack the vocabulary. Maybe in your conversation with you or further conversations, we'll figure out how to describe that dysfunctional ecosystem of, again, divergent interests that are not aligning in the way that a vertical oriented company or utility might, or a state might. And I think that brings us back to that theme, right?
Well, yeah. And so I'll add one other layer of the complexity. And I think that's a good point about Japan and the labor part of this, right? Because that is something I hear about a lot. I travel a lot in the US. And so since I was in London in early last month, and since then I've been in Little Rock, Kearney, Nebraska, and Des Moines, Iowa. And in all of those stops, what do I hear about? Labor shortages, right? That they don't have enough people. They're in Arkansas, there's something like 2 open jobs for every available worker. I talked to one guy who's in manufacturing. He said, we could hire 50 millwrights right now if I could find them. He said, I just can't get people who have skill, don't, and who are blue collar and know how to use a tape measure and weld, right? That these basic skills of the people that make things are lacking, right? And those are the people I hope to represent, or I want to speak for, to this extent that I can, people who grow things, make things, build things, right? Those are the ones that I'm all for them, because they are overlooked, and yet there aren't enough of those people. But I think this, so the labor, the capital, the fuel, and the regulation all come together, right? But it's, as you say, we didn't, all these supply chain issues, these things, these factors all come together. But further, it's about this ability to bring them all together at once in order to build this new capacity. And the other thing that I think is critical to remember about the United States, people, in Canada, you have, I don't know how many new electricity suppliers. It's only a handful, I believe. In Japan, there are 10. In the United States, we have 3,300.
Jesus Christ.
You have almost 900 cooperatives, 2,000 public power entities like Austin Energy, where I live, the city-owned utility. You have 180 some investor-owned utilities, and then you have the the federally owned entities like Tennessee Valley Authority and Bonneville Power. So it's over 3,000 different entities that in one form or another are delivering juice to the ultimate customer. And I haven't even mentioned the independent power producers, the Calpines and the NRGs and the others that are, in the business, but they aren't even in that segment of that I just mentioned. So it's just an incredibly complex system that we have here in the US, and to get them all singing from the same hymnal on anything is hard.
Well, Robert, I think that's probably we'll leave it. Fascinating.
We've had enough fun.
Oh God!
We could
go on for hours. I'd committed to 3 recordings today. I had to dial back so we can get to a Christmas party with the fiance. Happy wife, happy life. Always a pleasure, man. And I really did enjoy the conversational format here. It's just great having you as a friend, as a mentor. So thank you for making time to come back on Decouple. And
always a pleasure. Flattered to do it. And this is what I'm about. And fiance, look at you. Who knew? An ugly mug like you could get a woman interested in. It's amazing, but that's a beautiful thing. Congratulations.
Oh shucks. Thank you, Robert. I appreciate it.
Shucks, that's nice. seriously, congratulations. That's great. I'm pro marriage, Chris. It's a beautiful thing. Congratulations, my friend.
Thank you, sir. All right. Be well, Robert. We'll talk very soon, I'm sure.
Thanks, y'all.